Good morning. I am Dr. Sujithaa, Associate Professor of Anatomy from Sri Lakshminarayana Institute of Medical Sciences. So I'll be teaching about ventricles of brain. So ventricles of brain, as an overview, we will be seeing about its introduction, features of ventricles, parts and boundaries, and about the CSF circulation, and finally about the applied aspects. So ventricles of brain, we can see there are two C-shaped lateral ventricles. Then there is a third ventricle. Then there is a fourth ventricle. So we have two lateral ventricles, one third ventricle and one fourth ventricle. Now these two lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle by foramen of Monro, also called as interventricular foramen. Now this third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. Now in this picture we can see the C-shaped lateral ventricle. It is greenish in color. So each lateral ventricle is present within each cerebral hemisphere. So these are the lateral ventricles. Then we have the third ventricle, which is present between the two thalamus. Then we have the fourth ventricle, that is the cavity of hindbrain. So we can see the lateral ventricle, then we can see the third ventricle, then we can see the fourth ventricle. Now, lateral ventricle and third ventricle is connected by interventricular foramen of Monro. Third ventricle and fourth ventricle is connected by cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now the ventricles, it is lined by ependyma. It contains CSF and it has stela choroidea as well as choroid plexus. Now there are two lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles are present within each cerebral hemispheres. It is a C-shaped cavity lined with ependyma. It communicates with the third ventricle through interventricular foramen of Monro. Now we can see in this picture medial surface of the cerebrum. So this lateral ventricle is a cavity present within each cerebral hemispheres. So we can see this is the cerebral hemisphere. This cavity is called as lateral ventricle. Now we can see in this picture the lateral ventricle is very closely related to the caudate nucleus as well as thalamus. Caudate nucleus is green in color, thalamus is red in color, and the lateral ventricles are bluish in color. Okay. Now this is a coronal section wherein we can see septum pellucidum in between two lateral ventricles. Now this is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere wherein we can see the septum pellucidum closing the cavity, which is the lateral ventricle. Now parts of the lateral ventricle, we have got four parts, which is the central part of the body. There is an anterior horn, posterior horn, inferior horn. So there's a body, there's an anterior horn, posterior horn, inferior horn. Okay, so there's a body, anterior horn, posterior horn, inferior horn. So as we can see, the anterior horn is present within the frontal lobe. Body is present within the parietal lobe. Posterior horn is present within the occipital lobe. And the inferior horn is present within the temporal lobe. Now the central part is present within the parietal lobe and it extends from interventricular foramen to splenium of corpus callosum. So this one is the splenium of corpus callosum. So it extends from interventricular foramen to splenium of corpus callosum. Anterior horn is present within the frontal lobe. So this is present in front of the interventricular foramen to behind the genu of corpus callosum. So this one is present in front of the interventricular foramen to behind the genu of corpus callosum. So here we can clearly see the central part or the body. So it extends from interventricular foramen of Monro to splenium of corpus callosum. In front of the interventricular foramen of Monro is the anterior horn. So the parts of lateral ventricle we can clearly see here: anterior horn, central part of the body, posterior horn, and then inferior horn. So here we can see the anterior horn, central part, posterior horn, and then inferior horn. Posterior horn is projecting into the occipital lobe. Inferior horn is projecting into the temporal lobe. Of all the three horns, inferior horn is the largest one. Moving on to the boundaries of each part. Now, the central part or the body is triangular and it has got boundaries such as roof, medial wall, floor. Now, roof is formed by corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum, which we had seen in the previous slides. We saw the septum pellucidum was closing the cavity of the lateral ventricle. Then floor is formed by body of the caudate nucleus, stria terminalis, thalamostriate vein, thalamus, choroid plexus, body of the fornix. So we can see the central part here. Roof is formed by corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum. So floor we can see it is formed by caudate nucleus, stria terminalis, thalamostriate vein, and the thalamus and the choroid plexus. In this picture also, we can see the central part of the body of the lateral ventricle. Floor is formed by body of caudate nucleus, stria terminalis, and the thalamostriate vein. Then we have the thalamus, then is the body of the fornix. Now about the anterior horn. The anterior horn, as we know, is projecting into the frontal lobe. Now this has roof, floor, anterior wall, medial wall, lateral wall. Now roof is formed by body of corpus callosum. Floor is formed by rostrum of corpus callosum. Anterior wall is formed by genu of corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum. Lateral wall is formed by the bulging head of caudate nucleus. So we can see this is the anterior horn. It is projecting within the frontal lobe. So this is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere where we can see the cavity here. The cavity is the lateral ventricle. Then we see the anterior horn projecting into the frontal lobe. This is the anterior horn. So we can see the cavity of anterior horn. So medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum. On this side, we have the head of the caudate nucleus. So similar thing we can see in this coronal section. So we can see the cavity of lateral ventricle, which is the anterior horn. On this side, we have the septum pellucidum. On this side, we have the head of the caudate nucleus. Now, posterior horn, roof, lateral wall, floor is all formed by tapetum. So tapetum is derived from the splenium of corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by the bulb of posterior horn that is produced by the fibers of forceps major. Then we have calcareous, which is produced by the calcarine sulcus. So in this picture, we can see the posterior horn, and this posterior horn is forming a bulb that is caused by the forceps major. Then we have the calcarine sulcus that is causing calcar abyss. So on this side, we have the tapetum and the optic radiation. So in this picture, we can see the fibers of forceps major. Now posterior horn medial wall is formed by bulb of the posterior horn and the calcar abyss. So bulb of the posterior horn is formed by the forceps major fibers. Calcar abyss is produced by the calcarine sulcus. Now lateral wall is formed by the tapetum and the optic radiation. Now let's see about the inferior horn. As we know, the inferior horn projects into the temporal lobe and it is very closely related to the hippocampus. In this picture, we can see this is the hippocampus. This hippocampus looks like an animal's paw. Now, inferior horn medial wall or the floor is formed by the hippocampus, alveus, fimbriae, and the collateral eminence. So we can see this is the fimbriae of the hippocampus. Then we have the hippocampus itself, and we have the collateral eminence, which all are forming the medial wall. That is, the lateral wall is formed by the stria terminalis, tail of the caudate nucleus, and the tapetum. So in this picture, we can see the lateral wall is formed by the tail of the caudate nucleus. So in this picture, we can see the inferior horn. Its medial wall is formed by the hippocampus. Now, lateral wall is formed by the tail of the caudate nucleus, stria terminalis, as well as the tapetum. Now about the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, we can see this is a coronal section like this. So wherein we are able to see the inferior horn present within the temporal lobe. Now here we can see both body or the central part, also called as the central part of the lateral ventricle. Here we can see the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Now, as we know in this picture, we are able to see the parts of lateral ventricle, which is anterior horn, central part of the body, posterior horn, and then inferior horn. So we saw about the lateral ventricle. Now we shall see about the third ventricle. Now, third ventricle, it is called as the cavity of diencephalon. So it is a midline slit-like cavity situated between the two thalamus and a part of hypothalamus. So we can see this is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. We can see this one. This is the location of the third ventricle. So it is a cavity of diencephalon. So it is present between the two thalamus. So we can remember it like starting with the letter T. So between two thalamus is the third ventricle, which also starts with the letter T. Now we can see in this picture the two thalamus, and in between the two thalamus, this blue color thing is the third ventricle. Now we can also see the third ventricle is traversed by interthalamic adhesion. These interthalamic adhesion fibers are gray matter. Now, what is the extent of third ventricle? It extends anteriorly from lamina terminalis to posteriorly to the cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. Now, it extends anteriorly from lamina terminalis. So, posteriorly we can see cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. Now, the communications. It communicates with the lateral ventricle through interventricular foramen of Monro. It communicates posteriorly with the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So we can see in this picture, this is the third ventricle. It communicates with the two C-shaped cavity, which is the lateral ventricle through interventricular foramen of Monro. Now this third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now let's move on to the boundaries. Boundaries of third ventricle are anterior wall, posterior wall, roof, floor, and the two lateral walls. Now anterior wall is formed by anterior column of fornix, anterior commissure, lamina terminalis. So the anterior wall is formed by these structures, which is the anterior column of fornix. Then we have the anterior commissure, then there is lamina terminalis. Now posterior wall is formed by this pineal gland, posterior commissure, cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Pineal gland, posterior commissure, then we have the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now floor is formed by optic chiasma, then we have tuberous cynarium and infundibulum, then we have the mammillary body, then we have posterior perforated substance, then we have the tegmentum of midbrain. So floor is formed by all the structures from anterior to posterior, which includes optic chiasma, tuberous cynarium and infundibulum, mammillary body, posterior perforated substance, and tegmentum of midbrain. Roof, it extends from interventricular foramen to habenular commissure. Now the roof contains scala choroidea and the choroid plexus. Now lateral wall. We have two lateral walls. As we know, the third ventricle is present between the two thalamus. So the lateral wall will be formed by the thalamus. Just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Now between the thalamus and the hypothalamus there is a sulcus, that is hypothalamic sulcus. Now we are moving on to the recesses of third ventricle. So the recesses are 5 in number. They are infundibular recess, optic recess, anterior recess, suprapineal recess, pineal recess. From the name itself, we can appreciate that suprapineal and pineal recess are closely related to the pineal gland. Now, first one is the infundibular recess. This one is the infundibular recess. Next, we have the optic recess. Next, we have the anterior recess. Then we have the suprapineal recess. Then we have the pineal recess. So these 5 recesses are the recesses of third ventricle. Now, let's move on to the fourth ventricle. This fourth ventricle is a tent-like cavity of hindbrain. It has boundaries, recesses, angles. So, we can see it is the cavity of hindbrain. It is closely related to the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. In this picture, we are able to see the fourth ventricle here. So this we have already discussed, which is the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle. Now, this fourth ventricle is situated in posterior cranial fossa, behind the pons and upper part of medulla and in front of cerebellum. So in this picture, we can see this is the cerebellum. So the fourth ventricle is present in front of the cerebellum. This is the part of the brainstem, which is the pons and the upper part of the medulla oblongata. So the fourth ventricle is located behind the pons and medulla, but in front of cerebellum. So this is situated in posterior cranial fossa. Now this is triangular in sagittal section, rhomboid in coronal section. So we can see this is the coronal section, it is rhomboid, and this one is the sagittal section wherein we can see the fourth ventricle is triangular. Now let's see about the communications of fourth ventricle. It communicates above with the cerebral aqueduct, below with the central canal of the medulla. So this is the fourth ventricle. It communicates above with the cerebral aqueduct through which it is connected to the third ventricle. Now it communicates below with the central canal of medulla oblongata. oblongata. So let's move on to the boundaries of fourth ventricle. It has got roof, floor, lateral wall. So let's see about the roof and floor in this picture. So we can see when we keep the cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem in the anatomical position, we can very well see the cerebellum is slightly above. So the cerebellum forms the roof and the brainstem, pons and medulla oblongata forms the floor. In this picture, we can see the lateral wall. So superolaterally, it is formed by superior cerebellar peduncles. We can see the superior cerebellar peduncles here. So the superior cerebellar peduncle, it connects the midbrain and the cerebellum. Infralaterally, we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle as well as gracile and cuneate tubercles. So the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. So we can see the roof is tent shaped and it has got an upper and a lower sloping surface and the apex of the roof extends into the cerebellum. So we can see the roof is tent shaped. So it has got upper sloping surface, lower sloping surface. The roof is formed by cerebellum. So the apex extends into the cerebellum. Now upper part of roof is formed by the two superior cerebellar peduncles and then there is a superior medullary velum. So this one is the superior medullary velum. Lower part of the roof is formed by inferior medullary velum and then there is a large aperture which is called as foramen of Magenty. And this foramen of Magenty communicates with the subarachnoid space of the cerebello-medullary cistern, which is the cisterna magna. So lower part of the roof has this large aperture which is called as foramen of Magenty. And this foramen of Magenty communicates with the subarachnoid space of the cerebello-medullary cistern which is called as the cisterna magna. Now there is a central aperture in the roof that is the foramen of Magenty. There are two lateral apertures in the roof which is called foramina of Lashka. So these lateral apertures are called foramen of Lashka. Central aperture in the roof is called as foramen of Magenty. In this picture, we can also see the superior medullary velum between the superior cerebellar peduncles. Now, floor of the fourth ventricle. It is rhomboid in shape. That's why it's called as rhomboid fossa. You can see here it is rhomboid in shape. That's why it's called as the rhomboid fossa. Now, formation, it is formed by the posterior surface of the pons and the upper part of the medulla. So floor is formed by the pons and the upper part of medulla. Now floor, upper triangular part, lower triangular part. So that's rhomboid fossa is divided into upper triangular part and lower triangular part. Upper triangular part is formed by the posterior surface of pons. Lower triangular part is formed by the posterior surface of medulla. So we can see here, this is the posterior surface of pons. This is the posterior surface of medulla. Both are separated by stria medullaris. Both are separated by stria medullaris. That also we can see in this picture. Features of the floor. So in the floor we have a list of features. We shall see that is median sulcus. Then we have another sulcus called as sulcus limitans. Then we have medial eminence, vestibular area, superior fovea, locus ceruleus, then substantia ferruginea, inferior fovea, facial colliculus, which is abducens nucleus, hooked by the facial nerve fibers. Hypoglossal triangle, vagal triangle, funiculus separatus, area postrema, tinea, obex, calamus, cryptorius. We shall see all these features in pictures. As we know, this is posterior surface of pons, this is posterior surface of medulla, both are separated by stria medullaris. Now, posterior surface of pons, there is a sulcus that is called as median sulcus. On either side of the median sulcus, we have longitudinal elevation called as medial eminence. Now, over the medial eminence, we have a rounded elevation that is called as facial colliculus. Facial colliculus is produced by the abducent nucleus hooked by facial nerve fibers. Now, this is the posterior surface of medulla where we have two triangles, hypoglossal triangle and vagal triangle. We have the hypoglossal triangle, below we have the vagal triangle. Now in this picture, we can see the locus ceruleus. Then we have the superior fovea. So this sulcus is called as the sulcus limitus. So here we have the superior fovea and lateral to the hypoglossal and the vagal triangle is the vestibular area, and this one is the tinea, and this meeting point is called as the obex. Now in this picture again we shall see those features. In the center we have the median sulcus. On either side we have longitudinal elevation called as medial elevation or medial eminence. And here we have a rounded elevation called as facial colliculus. And laterally we have a sulcus that is sulcus limitans. Then we have the stria medullaris separating the pons and the medulla. Here we have the hypoglossal triangle, below that we have the vagal triangle. Here is the area postrema, then this dotted line is the funiculus separatus. We have the tinea here, the meeting point of the tinea is called as the obex. Here we have the locus ceruleus. You know the facial colliculus is produced by the abducent nucleus hooked by the facial nerve fibers. Moving on to the recesses of fourth ventricle. So recesses are the extensions from the cavity of fourth ventricle. There are two lateral recesses, then there is one median dorsal recess, two lateral dorsal recess. So we can see two lateral recesses, one dorsomedian recess, two dorsolateral recess. So these are the recesses of fourth ventricle. Moving on to the angles. So this one is the coronal section. So wherein we can see the angles of the fourth ventricle. There are around 4 angles, which is superior angle, inferior angle, and 2 lateral angle. So this is the fourth ventricle. This is the cavity of hindbrain. So we can see this one is the superior angle. This is the inferior angle. Then we have 2 lateral angles which are extending into the cerebellum. Little more details about the angles of fourth ventricle. Superior angle is continuous with the cerebral aqueduct. Inferior is continuous with the central canal of closed part of the medulla. So medulla oblongata has a upper open part and a lower closed part. 2 lateral angles, one on each side. They pass across the dorsal surface of inferior cerebellar peduncle. So the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. Now let's see about the openings in the fourth ventricle. So there is a central aperture in the lower part of the roof which is called as foramen of Magenti. Then there are 2 lateral apertures in the roof which is called foramen of Lashka. Then we have the central canal of medulla oblongata. Then is the cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. So in this picture we can see the foramen, which is the foramen of Magenti. Here will be the cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. So here is the central canal of medulla oblongata. These are the openings in the fourth ventricle. Moving on to the tela choroidea. So telochoroidea is a double-layered fold of biomatter. It is located between the vermis and the lower part of the roof of fourth ventricle. So it's a double-layered fold of biomatter. It's located between the vermis and the lower part of the roof of fourth ventricle. So in this picture, we can see this is the fourth ventricle. Now this side is the roof, this side is the floor, and this one is the lower part of the roof of fourth ventricle. Here is the parts of cerebellum, here we have the vermis. So between the vermis and the lower part of the roof of fourth ventricle, there is a double layered fold of biomatter which is called as the telochoroidea. Now let's see about the choroid plexus. It's a capillary plexus present between the telochoroidea. It is derived from posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It is T-shaped. It has got a vertical limb and a horizontal limb. The vertical limb is double, so it extends up to foramen of Mejenty. Horizontal limb, it extends through the lateral recess to the foramen of Lashka. So this is the vertical limb. So we can see the choroid plexus is T-shaped. It has the vertical limb. It has a horizontal limb. So we can see the vertical limb is double and the horizontal limb we can see here. And the vertical limb extends up to foramen of Mejenty, which is a central aperture present in the lower part of the roof. And this horizontal limb extends through the lateral recess to the foramen of Lashka. Now, blood supply of the ventricles altogether. So we saw about the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So telochoroidea of lateral and the third ventricle, they are derived from anterior choroidal and branches of posterior choroidal arteries and drained by choroidal vein. Whereas telochoroidea of fourth ventricle is derived from posterior inferior cerebellar artery and they are drained by basal veins. Now let's see about the circulation of CSF. Now CSF from the lateral ventricles, how they are carried to the other ventricles, we shall see. So CSF from the lateral ventricle is carried to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramina, which is the interventricular foramen of Monro. Now from the third ventricle, it's carried to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. Now from the fourth ventricle, it is carried to the subarachnoid space or the central canal. So we can see in this picture the C-shaped cavity, that is the lateral ventricle. And we can also see the parts of lateral ventricle, which is anterior horn, central part of the body. Then there is a posterior horn, then there is an inferior horn. Now this C-shaped lateral ventricles, which are present on each cerebral hemisphere, they are connected to the third ventricle by interventricular foramen of Monro. So the CSF from the lateral ventricle passes to the third ventricle through this interventricular foramen of Monro. Now from the third ventricle, it passes through the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. Now from the fourth ventricle, it passes through the central canal as well as to the subarachnoid space via this foramen of Mejenty and foramen of Lashka. Now, finally, the CSF is reabsorbed into the blood by arachnoid villi. Now, in this picture also, we can see about the CSF circulation. So, CSF is secreted by the choroid plexus in each lateral ventricles. So, here we can see the lateral ventricles, that is given number 1. So, CSF is secreted by the choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle. Now CSF flows through the interventricular foramen of Monro into the third ventricle. Now choroid plexus in the third ventricle, it adds more CSF. So the CSF is passed from lateral ventricle to third ventricle. So the lateral ventricle also has choroid plexus, third ventricle also has choroid plexus. This choroid plexus in the third ventricle now adds more CSF. Now CSF flows through the cerebral aqueduct, then it passes to the fourth ventricle. Now choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle still more adds CSF. Now CSF flows out through two lateral apertures and then one median apertures. So the median aperture is foramen of Magendie and the two lateral apertures of foramen of Leschka. So the CSF flows out through this median aperture and two lateral apertures. Now the CSF fills the subarachnoid space and bathes the external surfaces of brain and spinal cord. Now at the arachnoid villi, CSF is reabsorbed into the venous blood of dural venous sinuses. So this is the CSF circulation within the ventricles, and finally the CSF is absorbed into the venous blood of dural venous sinuses. So in this picture it is reabsorbed into the superior sagittal sinus. Now this red color structures we are able to see in lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle or the choroid plexus. We know the choroid plexus, it's derived from the choroidal arteries, anterior and posterior in case of lateral and third ventricle. Whereas in case of fourth ventricle, it is derived from posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now let's see about the applied anatomy. So hydrocephalus, Arnold-Chiari malformation, intraventricular hemorrhage, ependymal tumors, and subarachnoid hemorrhage. So any obstruction in the pathway of the CSF, we saw about the CSF circulation, anywhere there is obstruction, it leads to hydrocephalus. So we can see this is the normal ventricles. Here the ventricles are enlarged, which in turn leads to hydrocephalus. Tumors of the fourth ventricle, medulloblastoma, is most common in children. So we can see here it is highly malignant. It might press upon the floor of the ventricle, causing cardiac irregularities, tachycardia, irregular respiration, and vasomotor disturbances. We saw a list of features on the floor of the fourth ventricle. So when those structures are obstructed, when the tumor obstructs those structures, can cause all these irregularities such as cardiac irregularities, tachycardia, so because of the vagal triangle, irregular respiration, and the vasomotor disturbances. Now, ependymoma in the fourth ventricle. So there's proliferation of the ependymal cells. We know the ventricles are lined by ependyma. So proliferation of the ependymal cells, and there is obstruction to the flow of the CSF, which in turn leads to internal hydrocephalus. Now, this ventricular system of the brain can be visualized using CT scanning, magnetic resonance imaging, and then ventriculography. Now to summarize, we saw about the ventricles of brain. There are two lateral ventricles, and there is one third ventricle. That's why the third ventricle is called as the third ventricle, as we have two lateral ventricles, which is number 1 and 2. Then we have the fourth ventricle. Now the two lateral ventricles are located within each cerebral hemisphere. Now the lateral ventricle has parts, which is anterior horn, central part of the body, then there is posterior horn, and then there is inferior horn. Now the central part of the body is present within the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. Anterior horn is present within the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Posterior horn is present within the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Inferior horn is present within the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. So the parts of the lateral ventricle are anterior horn, central part of the body, then we have the posterior horn, then we have the inferior horn. So we have two lateral ventricles, and this lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle through intraventricular foramen of Monro. And this third ventricle is connected through cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius to the fourth ventricle. Now the third ventricle is a cavity of diencephalon. So diencephalon includes thalamus and hypothalamus. So the third ventricle is present between the two thalamus. So third ventricle and thalamus, they all start with the letter T. So between the two thalamus is the third ventricle. Now this third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now the fourth ventricle is the cavity of hindbrain. So the fourth ventricle is located between pons and medulla oblongata and then cerebellum. So the cerebellum forms the roof of the fourth ventricle. Pons and medulla oblongata, they form the floor of the fourth ventricle. Then we saw about the CSF circulation. So CSF circulation, it starts mainly in the two lateral ventricles. The choroid plexus adds CSF, and then from the lateral ventricle it passes through intraventricular foramen of Monro, and the choroid plexus in the third ventricle still more adds CSF, and the CSF passes from the third ventricle, it passes through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, just the cavity of the membrane, and then it passes to the fourth ventricle. So the choroid plexus in the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle also adds more CSF. So the choroid plexus, as they had more CSF in the fourth ventricle, now the CSF flows out through the apertures, through the foramen of Megenti, which is a central median aperture. Then we have two lateral apertures, which is foramen of Lashka. And as the CSF flows out through these apertures, it enters the subarachnoid space. Once the CSF enters the subarachnoid space, it bathes the whole brain as well as the spinal cord. Now, from the subarachnoid space, it is absorbed through the arachnoid villi into the venous blood of the dural venous sinuses. Now, this is the whole CSF circulation. Anywhere there is obstruction to the flow of CSF, there is a chance of hydrocephalus and the ventricles will be enlarged. Then the other applied anatomy, we saw about the ependymoma. This is the tumors of the fourth ventricle. And we saw about the other applied anatomy features. Then we could use CT and MRI to visualize this ventricles. Any enlargement or shrinking can be visualized by that. So altogether we saw about the ventricles of brain in this presentation. Thank you.